Detective Rachel King had spent years chasing shadows, investigating a string of disappearances that felt like the work of a master manipulator. But as she revisits the case that has haunted her for so long, something changes. A chilling thought creeps into her mind. What if the killer isn't just playing with his victims? What if he's been toying with her all along? As Rachel stares into a mirror, her own reflection begins to twist, morphing into something unrecognizable. The faces of the missing start to haunt her dreams and her waking hours. Is the killer real, or is he something far darker, something inside her mind? Before the fear begins, hit like and subscribe, don't miss the chills. Tell us where you're watching from, and brace yourself for stories so terrifying, they'll haunt your night. The case had always been a dark stain in Rachel King's career. It wasn't the first cold case she'd handled, but it was by far the one that never seemed to let go of her. The disappearances. The bizarre pattern. The eerie sense that someone was pulling the strings behind the scenes, manipulating not just the victims, but the entire investigation. It had started 5 years ago, just after her promotion to detective. At first, it seemed like a series of unrelated disappearances. People vanishing without a trace, no pattern, no motive. But then, Rachel started noticing something disturbing. The victims, each one, had left behind strange, inconsistent memories. The last moments they could recall before they vanished never quite lined up. Some described the killer in vivid detail, while others couldn't recall anything at all, as if their minds had been wiped clean. It wasn't just physical manipulation, it was psychological. Rachel had tried to push it aside, the creeping suspicion that this was no ordinary serial killer. But the more she dug, the more the evidence pointed to something more sinister. A presence, a manipulator, who wasn't just choosing his victims, but warping their memories, making them believe their own deaths were a natural conclusion of their lives. She couldn't let it go. She couldn't stop thinking about it. Her obsession had become all-consuming. The case files littered her desk at work, and at home, they haunted her thoughts. Every moment of silence was filled with questions she couldn't answer, gaps she couldn't close. She was certain the killer was still out there, his twisted influence continuing to spread. And now, Rachel was in too deep. But it wasn't until she started seeing the reflections that everything began to unravel. It started small, a flicker in the corner of her eye, a brief moment where her reflection didn't quite match her movements. She told herself it was just exhaustion, stress. But the incidents grew. The mirror became a window into something darker, something that she couldn't explain. One night, as Rachel stood in front of her bathroom mirror, brushing her hair, it happened. She saw it. Her reflection, the face that had always been hers, shifted. Her eyes, once sharp and focused, seemed to dull, darken, like a shadow passing over them. Her mouth twisted into a smirk that wasn't hers, one that was cruel, satisfied, and dangerous. Rachel froze, her heart pounding. She blinked. The reflection blinked with her. But when her eyes opened again, it was gone. Her reflection was normal again, just as it should be. She didn't know whether to be relieved or terrified. And that's when it hit her. This wasn't just a case anymore. It was her. She was part of it, somehow. She didn't know how, but the more she looked at the faces of the victims in her case files, the more she recognized them. Not their faces, but their eyes. Their empty eyes, staring back at her, as if they were looking through her, seeing something she couldn't see. And then, the most horrifying thought of all occurred to her. What if she had been one of the victims all along? But that didn't make sense. She hadn't disappeared. She'd never lost time. She had no missing memories, no gaps. She was still in control of her mind, wasn't she? The deeper she dug, the more fragmented her reality became. The moments she'd assumed were random accidents, small, disorienting incidents, began to feel like the result of something far more calculated, far more dangerous. The lines between what she remembered and what was real started to blur. Rachel stared at the files in front of her, a sick realization creeping over her like ice water. Each photograph, each crime scene, felt like a scene from a dream she couldn't escape from. Faces she'd seen before. Details she couldn't remember living through. Was it the killer's manipulation? Or was it her own mind twisting to make sense of something she didn't understand? Her obsession grew. She couldn't stop thinking about the connection, the thread that tied all the victims together. The memories. But the more she investigated, the more her own mind seemed to slip from her grasp. Each day she spent on the case, the harder it became to separate the past from the present. The nightmares became more vivid. She would wake up in cold sweats, gasping for air, her own screams ringing in her ears. The killer had found her. He had been inside her mind all along, planting seeds of doubt, creating false memories, erasing the truth. And now, as Rachel stared into her reflection in the bathroom, she wasn't sure if she could trust the woman staring back at her. Was this the real Rachel King? Or was she a puppet, a piece in a game she couldn't see? Her thoughts were interrupted by a loud knock at the door. Detective King. It was her partner, Jacob, his voice muffled through the wood. "We need to talk." Rachel blinked, startled. The reflection in the mirror still looked wrong. She turned away from it, taking a deep breath. She couldn't afford to fall apart now. Not yet. The door creaked open, and Jacob stepped inside, his face pale. "There's something you need to see," he said quietly, his eyes flicking nervously toward the mirror, like he could sense something was off. "It's about the case. There's been another disappearance." Rachel's pulse quickened. She could already feel the weight of it bearing down on her. She had to know. She had to see what had happened. But as she followed Jacob out of the room, a nagging feeling twisted in her gut. Something wasn't right. She wasn't just chasing a killer anymore. The case had become her. And she was terrified she wouldn't be able to tell the difference anymore. The new disappearance was unlike anything Rachel had seen before. Another victim, another broken life. A woman named Anna Clark. The file was sparse, and the details that were there only deepened the mystery. Anna had been a well-known therapist, with a solid reputation in the community. She'd vanished without a trace, but there were hints that she had been acting strange in the days leading up to her disappearance. Rachel leaned over the desk, examining the case file in front of her. Anna's colleagues described her as distant, almost detached, during the last few sessions she'd held with patients. But it wasn't just that. What troubled Rachel the most was the subtle hints that Anna had begun to lose grip on her own memories. People spoke of her asking the same questions repeatedly, of her looking into the eyes of her patients like she was seeing something else. Like she was looking past them, into a space that didn't belong to this world. Jacob stood behind her, arms crossed, waiting for her to process the information. His presence was a strange comfort, but also a reminder that this case was slipping further into the unknown. "She saw something, didn't she?" Rachel muttered, almost to herself. Jacob nodded. "I think so. Something we didn't." Rachel's fingers tightened around the edges of the file. She could feel it now, a cold chill creeping up her spine. This wasn't just a case anymore. It was a thread unraveling, pulling her deeper into a nightmare she couldn't control. It wasn't long before Rachel began to see more connections, ones she hadn't wanted to make. Each new victim was tied to someone in her life. Not in a direct way, but in ways that were starting to feel far too close for comfort. Anna Clark, the therapist, had treated one of Rachel's childhood friends. Another victim had lived down the street from Rachel's old apartment. Every new lead felt like another piece of her own past slipping out of place, like the killer was somehow connected to her, specifically. But the most disturbing part came that night, as Rachel sat in her apartment, reviewing old case notes. She was alone. The only sound was the hum of her desk lamp, casting a sharp, unsettling shadow against the walls. Her phone buzzed with a message from Jacob, but she didn't look at it right away. Her eyes were drawn to the photograph pinned to the wall, a picture of the first victim, taken just hours before her disappearance. Rachel had spent days studying it. But tonight, it wasn't the victim's face that caught her attention. It was the reflection in the glass. Rachel's pulse quickened as she leaned in closer, her breath fogging up the glass. In the picture, the woman's reflection was distorted, like something was wrong with the surface of the glass. At first, it seemed like a trick of the light, but then Rachel's breath caught in her throat. In the reflection, a shadow loomed behind the woman. A figure, tall and dark, standing in the corner. It wasn't just the shadow of the room, it was something more, something solid, with a shape and form. Something alive. Rachel jerked back, her heart thumping in her chest. She scrambled to her phone, tapping out a quick message to Jacob, but before she could press send, her reflection in the darkened window behind her shifted. She froze. Her own image stared back at her, but not in the way it should. The face was twisted, warped. The features didn't belong to her anymore. Her eyes were sunken, hollow, filled with a darkness she couldn't recognize. Her mouth curled into a smile she hadn't made, and the reflection tilted its head as if studying her. Rachel backed away, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Was she losing her mind? Was it stress, fatigue, the case eating away at her sanity? Or was this something worse? Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from the hallway. Rachel spun around, her body tensing, her hand instinctively reaching for the gun holstered at her side. She hurried to the door, her heart pounding in her chest, but when she flung it open, nothing. The hall was empty. Her breath steadied as she glanced at the phone in her hand, her thumb hovering over Jacob's message. But when she opened it, her eyes went wide. The message was strange, an image, not a text. A picture of her. The woman in the photo was wearing the same clothes Rachel had on tonight. It had been taken from behind, but the face that stared back from the picture wasn't hers. It was the twisted reflection. The same smile, the same hollow eyes. Rachel stumbled back, the phone slipping from her hand and crashing to the floor. How could someone have taken that picture? She had been alone. And as the silence of the apartment grew thick and suffocating, something began to whisper in the back of her mind, something she couldn't ignore anymore. She wasn't alone. Not now. Not ever. This case, the victims, the disappearances, the faces that didn't belong, this wasn't a random series of events. There was something deliberate happening, something that tied Rachel to it all, something she couldn't escape. Her reflection wasn't the only thing that was changing. And the deeper she dug into this case, the more she realized that the killer wasn't just manipulating memories. He was shaping them. Making people believe things that weren't true. Making them question their very existence. And soon, Rachel would be forced to question her own. The next morning, Rachel's world began to crumble. She sat in the detective squad room, staring at the photos spread across her desk, the evidence she'd gathered. She had always prided herself on her ability to stay focused, to separate the personal from the professional. But now, every detail felt suffocating, closing in around her. The image of Anna Clark, the woman whose face haunted Rachel's memory, lay in front of her. The cold, empty eyes stared back, but the image had begun to blur in Rachel's mind. It was as if she couldn't remember the real Anna anymore. She couldn't even remember why she had started to investigate her case in the first place. The further Rachel went into this, the more everything started to unravel. Was Anna really the victim she thought she was? Was anyone? Or had it all been planned this way? The case notes on her desk were similarly distorted. Victim after victim, their stories were starting to overlap. What had once seemed like a string of random disappearances now felt like part of something bigger, something designed to create confusion. The pattern of psychological manipulation was becoming clearer, but there was a deeper truth that gnawed at her. Was she, too, being manipulated? As Rachel sat there, rubbing her temples, the door to the squad room opened with a creak. Her partner, Jacob, stepped inside. His face was tense, as though he'd seen something that had rattled him just as much as Rachel's discoveries had rattled her. "Rachel," he said softly, his voice low. "We need to talk. I think you're right. There's something going on here that we're missing. Something wrong." He dropped a file on her desk, the sound of it hitting the wood startling in the otherwise quiet room. Rachel looked up. The file was new, untouched by her investigation, she hadn't seen it before. The name on the cover chilled her, Rachel King, missing person. "What the hell is this?" Rachel asked, her voice trembling as she flipped open the file. Inside, there was an old police report, one she had never seen. The report detailed a missing persons case, her missing persons case, from 5 years ago. She read the first few lines aloud, disbelief crawling up her spine. Detective Rachel King, 28 years old, last seen leaving the station late at night. Last known location, her apartment. A search of the premises revealed no signs of foul play, but traces of her personal items were missing. No leads. She stopped reading. The words didn't make sense. She had never been reported missing. Jacob's face paled as he watched her struggle to comprehend what she was reading. Rachel. I don't know what to make of it. But this file, it says you were missing for 3 days. We thought you'd just been off the grid. You were gone. No one could reach you. But we found you, and you didn't remember any of it. Rachel's pulse skyrocketed, her hands trembling as she placed the file back on the desk. The more she read, the more the world around her seemed to shift. Her apartment, her memories, none of it was adding up. She had no recollection of being missing, no memory of those 3 days. Was this another manipulation? Had she been part of this before? Her eyes went to the photo of Anna Clark once more. And then, as if on cue, a voice, soft and familiar, whispered in her ear. You were always part of it, Rachel. You just didn't know. Rachel jerked back, her chair scraping against the floor. She spun around to face the voice, but there was no one there. Her breath quickened. She was beginning to question whether she was truly losing her mind or if something had been planted inside her, manipulating her from within. The voice came again, this time louder. It's inside you, Rachel. The killer. He's been inside you all along. Her head throbbed, the words reverberating inside her skull. Desperately, Rachel turned to Jacob. Jacob, what the hell is going on? Why am I seeing things? Why am I hearing things? Why can't I remember being missing? Jacob opened his mouth to speak, but before he could answer, the lights in the room flickered. The air turned cold. A deep, gnawing silence filled the space. Rachel's mind swirled with 1,000 possibilities, each darker than the last. She gripped the edge of the desk, trying to steady herself, but the more she focused on the case files in front of her, the more the words seemed to twist and distort. The faces of the victims, their eyes, began to bleed into her own reflection, their features warping, their expressions mirroring the madness that was slowly creeping into her own mind. Suddenly, the air was thick with tension. Rachel's fingers brushed the edge of the file that Jacob had placed in front of her, but when she glanced down at it, she saw something different. A handwritten note in the margins, written in dark ink, in a handwriting that was unmistakably her own. You've been chosen, Rachel. You're the next victim. Rachel's breath hitched in her throat, her vision spinning as she looked up at Jacob, whose face was now strangely empty, as if his very essence had been drained from him. The world felt like it was slipping away. Was this real? Was any of this real? Or was she still the victim of some twisted game? Was she losing herself piece by piece? Rachel. Jacob whispered, his voice now sounding like an echo. We're running out of time. The room began to distort. The floor beneath her seemed to twist and bend, the walls stretching outward as though the very space around her was unraveling. The faces in the photographs stared back at her, their eyes growing more familiar. Too familiar. Her own eyes. You're already one of us. She didn't know who said it, whether it was Jacob, the killer, or some twisted reflection of herself. All Rachel knew was that her grip on reality was slipping, and as the walls closed in around her, one horrifying truth became clear. This case wasn't about the victims anymore. It was about her. She was the next target. And she wasn't sure if she could stop it. Rachel's heart pounded in her chest as the distorted room began to settle back into focus. The oppressive silence was broken only by the sound of her own shaky breathing. She was no longer sure of what was real. The walls, the desk, the photos, they all felt wrong. Like she was trapped in a space where the rules of the world had been warped, manipulated. She felt like she was being watched, every shadow in the room growing deeper, more alive. Jacob, standing motionless in front of her, suddenly seemed too still. His face was like a blank canvas, expressionless, as if he were a puppet frozen mid-motion. And then, without warning, he spoke again, his voice cold and hollow. Rachel, it's time you understood. Time you saw the truth. Rachel blinked. Her gaze flicked from Jacob's unmoving face to the file in front of her. The note. The note she had just read moments ago. You've been chosen, Rachel. You're the next victim. Her eyes scanned the rest of the file. The words were hazy, like a bad dream, and she found herself focusing on the document in a detached way, almost like someone else was making her read it. The handwriting, her own handwriting. It was scribbled on the page, an urgent warning. But why couldn't she remember writing it? Why did it feel like it had always been there, as if the file had been waiting for her? Her fingers trembled as she turned the page, her eyes widening. The words that followed stopped her cold. I know what you've been doing, Rachel. I know what you're trying to uncover. The truth isn't what you think it is. The killer isn't just out there. The killer is in you. You've been carrying him this whole time, and you've been blind to it. The cold realization crept into her bones, like ice flowing through her veins. Her throat tightened, the breath in her lungs refusing to come. She wouldn't believe it. No, this couldn't be true. Rachel, Jacob whispered, taking a step forward. His voice had lost all its warmth, now only a low, guttural tone that made the hairs on her neck stand on end. The memories you've been uncovering, they aren't yours. They were planted in you. All of it. You've been chasing a phantom, Rachel. The killer has been inside you the whole time, and now, it's too late. She spun around to face him, her hands shaking violently as she tried to grasp the weight of his words. Inside me? Her mind spun with possibilities, with terror. She didn't know how long she'd been living in a lie. Was everything she had known, everything she had done, some part of the killer's influence? And then it hit her. A memory. The missing piece. 5 years ago, the night she had disappeared. Rachel hadn't gone missing. She had been taken. She remembered now. There had been flashes, brief, fleeting moments, but they were enough. A dark figure standing over her, his face masked by shadows. His hands were cold, gripping her shoulders. His voice, a low whisper, "You've been chosen." Her mind had blocked out everything that happened after that. But she now understood. She had never truly escaped. The killer hadn't just abducted her. He had embedded himself into her psyche. He had planted those memories, the ones that made her investigate this case. The ones that had made her believe she was a detective chasing a killer. But the truth was far darker than she ever imagined. Rachel staggered backward, her hand instinctively pressing to her forehead. "No, I've been hunting myself," she whispered. Her voice felt alien to her own ears. "All this time, it was me." Jacob didn't answer. Instead, he reached out toward her, his fingers outstretched, his movements slow, like he had all the time in the world. And in that moment, Rachel realized something more terrifying than any killer's presence. The killer didn't need to be outside her. He was inside her mind, whispering, playing her like a marionette. And now, he was in control. "You are the killer, Rachel," Jacob said, his voice now low and distorted. "You just haven't remembered yet. But you will. And when you do, there will be nothing left of you." Rachel's knees buckled as the full weight of her realization crashed down on her. She gripped the desk to steady herself, trying to hold on to the fragments of her sanity. She was drowning, suffocating in a tide of lies and illusions. But as the room began to spin, something inside her snapped. She had to fight. She couldn't let him win. She couldn't let him consume her. With everything she had left, Rachel shoved the file off the desk, scattering papers everywhere. She could feel the killer's presence inside her, like a shadow closing in around her mind, whispering of death and destruction. She couldn't let herself be taken. Not again. Not like this. Her eyes darted around the room, looking for something, anything, that could break her out of this nightmare. And then, her gaze fell on the only thing left in the room that hadn't changed, the mirror. The mirror. It was the one place she hadn't looked. The one place that held the truth. She had to face it. She had to see what had become of her. With a trembling hand, Rachel stepped toward the full-length mirror hanging on the wall. The reflection that stared back at her was wrong. Her eyes, those eyes empty, hollow, devoid of all light, were staring back at her with something far more chilling than just madness. They were filled with recognition. She wasn't looking at herself. She was looking at him. The killer. A dark grin twisted across the reflection's face, and then, in a voice that was her own yet not, the reflection whispered, "I've always been here, Rachel. Waiting." And in that moment, Rachel realized, she was the killer. Her hands trembled as she reached for her gun, but when she looked down at her hands, They were already stained with blood, stained with her own blood. The room spun faster, her grip loosening, the gun slipping from her fingers, clattering to the floor. The reflection in the mirror continued to grin, its eyes growing darker, deeper, until they swallowed everything. Rachel was gone. The silence in the room was suffocating. Rachel stood frozen before the mirror, her hand still hovering in the air where the gun had just slipped from her fingers. The world around her was bending, twisting, and then, the reflection in the glass began to change. It wasn't her anymore. It couldn't be her. Her body, her face, her posture, it was all wrong. The reflection in front of her was standing taller now, with an unnatural calm. Its smile was wide, grotesque, stretching unnaturally across its face, as though it were trying to hold the shape of a human grin but failing horribly. The eyes, her eyes, were dark and empty, like two black holes pulling everything in. The killer's smile widened, and then the reflection whispered something. "You've seen it now, haven't you? It's too late, Rachel. You're mine." Her heart pounded so violently, she thought it would burst. A cold sweat drenched her back as she stumbled backward, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She could hear her breath quickening, each inhale louder and more desperate than the last. Rachel was lost. Her thoughts were jumbled, her mind screaming at her to wake up, but she couldn't. This wasn't a dream. This was real. She backed away from the mirror, her body hitting the wall with a thud. The room seemed to close in around her, the air thick and suffocating, as though the very walls had begun to crowd her. She turned to the door, the one exit that had always been there, but as she reached for the handle, it refused to budge. No. No. This was impossible. She had to leave. She had to find a way out. The darkness in the corners of the room seemed to shift, like shadows with lives of their own, watching her, creeping closer. She could hear the whispers again, soft, coaxing, like 1,000 voices urging her to surrender. The killer's voice wasn't just inside her mind anymore, it was all around her, in the very fabric of the room. "Rachel, you can't run from yourself." She whipped around, her breath catching in her throat as the reflection in the mirror began to move independently, its eyes following her every movement. No, this couldn't be happening. She was not the killer. She wasn't. She couldn't be. And yet, the more she tried to deny it, the more the truth settled in her gut like a poison she couldn't expel. The case. The victims. The missing days. The twisted memory. It was all leading her to this moment. She wasn't the detective. She wasn't the one hunting the killer. She had been the killer all along. Her hands, shaking uncontrollably, gripped her head, pulling at her hair as the realization consumed her. She was trapped. The killer was her. And no matter where she ran, she couldn't escape the truth. The door, still locked, suddenly rattled violently. She heard it again, the sound of someone or something on the other side, trying to break through. Her heart raced. She could barely breathe. With a final, desperate effort, Rachel pulled herself away from the door, stumbling toward the window. She had to get out. She couldn't be stuck here, not with Erit. But when she opened the window, the cold night air rushing in felt wrong. She wasn't looking out onto the city streets. No. What she saw beyond the window was nothing but a vast emptiness, a void that stretched out into infinity. The ground wasn't there anymore. The buildings were gone. It was just darkness. Endless darkness. The void. She was in the void. Rachel felt her legs weaken, her body threatening to collapse under the weight of the overwhelming terror. She slammed the window shut, but the darkness beyond only seemed to press in closer. She was trapped in a world that wasn't real. In a place where time and space had no meaning. Behind her, the mirror continued to twist and warp. The reflection now seemed to float, a grotesque, contorted version of herself, like a macabre puppet held up by invisible strings. It spoke again, its voice distorting as it echoed through the room. "You're not going to leave, Rachel. You never will. Because you're already here, with me. Always." Rachel spun around, a scream clawing its way up her throat, but before she could even make a sound, the room seemed to collapse in on her. The walls and floor began to melt, warping into shapes that defied reality, and everything was bending toward the mirror. The reflection reached out, its twisted hands coming through the glass, grabbing hold of her arms. No! Rachel screamed, trying to break free, but the grip was inescapable. The reflection's fingers dug into her skin, as cold as ice, draining her of any warmth. It pulled her closer. She could feel herself slipping, her own consciousness unraveling like a thread pulled too tight. The killer's voice whispered in her ear, and this time, it wasn't just a whisper. It was inside her, crawling through her mind, taking her. "We're one now, Rachel. We always have been. You and I. And you can't escape me. You've never been in control." Her body fought against the pull, but her limbs felt like lead. The air was thick, suffocating, as if she were drowning in the reflection's grip. And then, as if the room was collapsing completely around her, everything stopped. It was like being submerged in freezing water. The silence, the stillness, was overwhelming. Rachel could barely breathe, barely think. And then, she saw something in the center of the darkness. A shadow. A figure. But this time, it wasn't her reflection. It was the figure from that night 5 years ago, the dark silhouette that had taken her, that had stolen her memories. It had always been watching. It reached out toward her, and for a fleeting moment, Rachel saw the face behind the darkness. It was her face. But, twisted. Hollow. Empty. She was the killer. And with that final, horrifying revelation, the world around her collapsed entirely into darkness. Rachel didn't know how much time had passed since the darkness had swallowed her. Seconds, hours, days, everything had melted together into an endless, oppressive blackness. She felt like she was floating in the middle of a nightmare, suspended between two worlds, unable to touch either. There was no up, no down, no time. Just the weight of the killer's presence pressing in on her. And then, without warning, the silence was shattered. A sudden flicker of light, a spark, shot through the dark like a broken piece of glass. It hurt her eyes, stinging and sharp. And then another flash. More. The darkness began to crack. Rachel gasped, her breath catching in her throat as she tried to push herself forward, but there was no ground beneath her. She was still weightless, but now, in this infinite void, she could feel something different. Something real. The light pulsed again, almost rhythmic, like the beating of a heart. It was like a signal, pulling her toward it. She reached out instinctively, her hands stretching toward the light. The closer she got, the clearer the edges of the light became, and the more familiar the sensation was. It was like waking from a deep, painful sleep. Her body hurt. Her head ached. And then, in a final desperate push, she crossed the threshold into the light. For a brief moment, she was blinded by the intensity of it, but then the pain dulled and the world around her began to take shape again. She was back. She was standing in the same room, the same office, the one she had entered what felt like an eternity ago. But now everything was different. The walls were cracked, the furniture overturned, like a scene from a terrible dream. The air smelled stale, heavy with the remnants of something lost. But Rachel could still feel it, the presence. The killer. Behind her, the reflection in the mirror was gone. The reflection. Rachel's pulse quickened, and she spun around, her eyes frantically scanning the room. It felt like she had stepped out of one nightmare and into another, but this place wasn't the world she had known. There were no more answers, only the relentless pull of the unknown. And then, standing at the far end of the room, she saw it. The figure. It was him. Her mind refused to let her believe it, but there was no denying it. The figure, shrouded in shadow, his form cloaked in darkness, moved with a slow, deliberate step toward her. And Rachel felt it, the pull. The deep, visceral understanding that she was not alone. He wasn't just standing there, he was already inside her. Inside her mind. Watching her. He had always been watching. Rachel. His voice was soft. Hollow. Unrecognizable, yet familiar all the same. It echoed in her head, the sound wrapping around her skull like a vice. "I told you this would happen. You never escaped me." Rachel stumbled back, her body shaking, but her feet felt like lead. The memories, the images, everything she'd tried to block out came rushing back with a vengeance. The dark figure stepped closer, revealing his face. But it wasn't a face at all, not really. It was her face. only it was twisted, fragmented, distorted like a cracked mirror. The eyes were hollow, like empty pits, black as night. His smile was a grotesque mockery of her own. You thought you could find the killer, didn't you? You thought you could solve it, bring justice. But you've been chasing a ghost. You are the ghost, Rachel. Her breath caught in her throat. This wasn't possible. It wasn't real. But the voice, it was her voice. It was like the killer was inside her mind, peeling apart the layers of her sanity. Her mind had never been her own. Her heart thundered in her chest as she backed away, her head spinning. The memories of the past 5 years swirled around her, those long, empty nights of investigation, the missing hours she couldn't account for, the inexplicable gaps in time. Was it all him? Had he been inside her, controlling her all along? You've been chasing me, Rachel. All the while, I've been in you, pulling the strings. No. Rachel shook her head violently, trying to force the words out of her mind, but they kept pushing through, like whispers that refused to fade. The truth was unbearable. She wasn't chasing the killer. She was becoming the killer. No, she screamed, her voice raw. This isn't me. I won't let you take me. But the figure, her reflection, simply smiled. It wasn't her anymore. It had never been her. The figure lunged forward with a speed that took Rachel by surprise. Before she could react, a sharp, searing pain erupted across her chest. She gasped for breath, her hands instinctively clutching at her own body, but there was no wound. No blood. The pain wasn't physical, it was something deeper, more insidious. It was in her mind, in her soul. The killer wasn't just manipulating her, he was consuming her. Her thoughts began to fragment, her vision narrowing, blurring at the edges. She could no longer differentiate between what was real and what was a figment of her twisted mind. It was then that she saw it, the truth. She had never been free. She had never escaped. All the memories she thought were her own, the case, the investigation, the missing time, were his. The killer had always been inside her, forcing her to live this nightmare. And in that moment of clarity, Rachel understood. She wasn't just the victim of the killer. She was the killer. She closed her eyes, her body trembling as the weight of the realization crashed over her. There was no escape. She had been lost from the very beginning. Rachel's vision blurred as the world around her seemed to fold in on itself. She could feel the darkness wrapping around her like a suffocating shroud, pulling her deeper into the abyss. The figure, the killer, was no longer a separate entity. It was her. It was all of her. She was lost, tangled in the web of her own fractured psyche, unable to escape the inevitable. The realization settled like a weight inside her chest. She wasn't trapped in a room. She wasn't in a house. She wasn't even in reality anymore. She was lost inside her own mind. Her thoughts were like fragmented shards of glass, sharp and dangerous, cutting through the fog of confusion. The case. The victims. The missing memories. The strange, terrifying moments she couldn't explain. All of it, every single moment, had been leading her here, to this place of no return. She had thought she was chasing the killer. She had believed, for so long, that she was the one hunting. But now, she knew the truth. She had been the one being hunted. Her reflection. Her mind. Her own darkest fears made flesh. The walls around her, those cracked, decaying walls of her mind, seemed to close in, the air growing thick and heavy with the crushing weight of truth. The shadows danced in every corner, whispering things she couldn't ignore, things she didn't want to hear. Do you feel it? The voice of the killer, her voice, whispered from the dark corners of her mind. It was inside her now. She couldn't escape it. She could never escape. Every choice you made, the voice continued, every step you took led you here. You thought you were in control. But you were never in control, Rachel. Rachel stumbled, her hands clutching her head as the pain in her skull intensified, her mind splintering further. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. How had it come to this? The faces of the victims flashed before her eyes, their hollow gazes boring into her soul. She had never been able to help them. She had failed them. And now, their spirits were trapped within her, their pain, their fear, their death, they were all hers. She couldn't undo it. She couldn't fix it. But worse than the guilt, the crushing, suffocating guilt, was the creeping realization that she hadn't just failed them. She had become them. The killer's voice, her own voice, whispered once more. "You've been chasing the truth, Rachel. But there is no truth. There is only me." Her eyes snapped open, and the room around her twisted once more. The darkness shifted, morphed, and she found herself standing in an alley. Cold rain pelted her face, but she couldn't feel it. She couldn't feel anything. Not anymore. There, at the end of the alley, stood the figure, her figure. It was her face, but it wasn't. The smile that twisted across the reflection was cold, predatory. It was everything Rachel had tried to avoid, everything she had worked so hard to suppress. She tried to step back, but her feet wouldn't move. She couldn't run. She was already there. The figure didn't speak this time. It didn't need to. Rachel's body betrayed her as the darkness closed in, a suffocating force she couldn't escape. Her mind was no longer her own. Her thoughts, her actions, her decisions, they had all been manipulated. She had been nothing more than a puppet, her strings pulled by the hands of the killer. But now, there was no one left to control her. She was alone. The figure moved closer, and Rachel, no longer the detective, no longer the woman who had fought so hard to understand the case, was finally ready to face the one truth she couldn't escape. It was over. She was the killer. In the end, the game had never been about finding answers. It had always been about breaking her. And in that moment, Rachel finally understood. The killer had won. The room fades to black. The weight of Rachel's confession hangs heavy in the air, a haunting reminder of the fragility of the human mind and the darkness that lurks within us all. What if the person you've been chasing has always been inside you? Was Rachel always the killer? Was she manipulated? Or was she just another victim of her own mind? The line between truth and madness is razor-thin, and Rachel's descent into it is a chilling reminder that sometimes the most terrifying things aren't out there, but inside us. Do you believe your mind can betray you like that? Can someone truly lose themselves in the pursuit of a killer, only to become one themselves? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And, if you enjoyed this journey into the darkness, make sure to subscribe for more stories that will leave you questioning what's real and what isn't.